The woods were never meant to be entered after sundown. Locals said the air turned thicker there, like breathing through sorrow itself. But when a team of investigators was sent to uncover what the townsfolk only whispered about, they didn't expect to find the remnants of a family so intertwined that even science struggled to tell them apart. It started on a gray October morning when the mist clung to the mountains like breath on glass. 3 hikers, locals from a nearby town, had set out early, planning to reach a ridge that no one had climbed in decades. The trail was supposed to end at an old mining road, but the deeper they walked, the less the forest seemed to follow any map. The trees grew closer together, their roots twisting over the ground like veins, and the sunlight that filtered through was pale and cold. They followed the faint sound of running water until they reached a small clearing, and that was where they saw it, a cabin half swallowed by earth and ivy, as if the forest had tried to reclaim it and failed. At first glance, it looked abandoned. The roof had caved in on one side, and the windows were clouded with dirt. But there was something strangely deliberate about its position. The front door was bolted shut, and the path leading to it was swept clean, though there hadn't been a footprint in the surrounding mud for years. The hikers hesitated, feeling the weight of stillness around them. Then one of them, curious and a little reckless, picked up a fallen branch and pushed the door open. The hinges let out a sound that was half a groan and half a sigh, and the air that spilled out was heavy with the scent of rot and iron. Inside, the cabin looked as if someone had simply stood up from dinner and never returned. There were plates on the table, covered in a thin layer of dust but still perfectly arranged, as though waiting for a family to sit down. A set of old photographs hung crookedly on the wall. When one of the hikers wiped the surface clean, the image revealed a man, a young woman, and a little girl, their faces eerily similar, each with the same wide, pale eyes. In every photo, the same 3 figures reappeared, only slightly older, their clothes changing but not their expressions. In the corner of the room was a small wooden cradle. It looked handmade, its edges carved with intricate patterns of hearts and vines. One of the hikers leaned down and saw something tucked inside, a small rag doll with human hair sewn into its head. Just as they turned away, the cradle shifted, a slow, rhythmic rock, back and forth, though no one had touched it and no breeze stirred the air. A sudden unease swept through the group. Without saying a word, they backed out of the cabin, the sound of the door closing behind them louder than it should have been. None of them spoke for the rest of the hike, but each knew they had found something that wasn't meant to be found. The journal was discovered 2 days after the cabin's initial report, when investigators returned to document the site. The air inside was colder than before, as though something had changed in the hours since it was first opened. Dust still floated thick in the light that slipped through the cracks, and a layer of frost had formed on the inside of the windows despite the mild autumn weather outside. It was one of the officers who found it, a small, leather-bound book hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the corner where the cradle had stood. The cover was darkened with age, the leather cracked, and the initials CM had been pressed faintly into the surface. When they opened it, the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic rose up, like old blood. The first few pages were blank, but the ones that followed were written in elegant, slanted handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. The entries began innocently enough, describing daily life in the woods, the changing of seasons, and the quiet beauty of isolation. The author, a woman named Clara, wrote of her home in the valley and the men she called father. She described him as a kind, patient man who had raised her after the rest of their family had gone to sleep beneath the ground. But the further the investigators read, the stranger the tone became. Clara began referring to him not only as father but as husband, and later, as creator. Her words shifted from gratitude to devotion, and finally to fear disguised as affection. Each page felt like descending deeper into a mind trapped between love and horror. There were moments in the journal where Clara seemed aware of what she had become part of. She wrote of children born without eyes that see the sun, and of a sickness that grew stronger with each generation. Yet she spoke of it not as a curse, but as a continuation, the perfection of a bloodline untainted by the outside world. She wrote that father told her their love was pure because it began and ended within them, a circle unbroken by strangers. Near the end of the book, her handwriting grew shaky, the ink smudged and rushed. The final entries were no longer addressed to anyone but herself. In one, she wrote that she could hear voices in the walls, her own voice echoing back at her, whispering lullabies she didn't remember singing. The last words on the final page were barely visible, pressed deep into the paper as though carved with trembling hands. He made me from himself, and now he wants me back. When the forensic team began analyzing the remains and personal belongings found within the cabin, what they uncovered defied reason. Samples were collected from the bones buried behind the structure, from strands of hair caught in the bedframe, and from the old toothbrushes and combs left on the shelf. It was routine work at first, the kind of examination that usually yielded simple answers about ancestry and relation. But the first results made no sense. The DNA from every sample, male, female, and even infant, was nearly identical. Not just similar as one might expect between family members, but matching to a degree that blurred the lines between individual identity. It was as if the same person had been copied and reborn again and again. The lab assumed contamination, running the tests multiple times. But each repetition brought the same chilling outcome. The mitochondrial DNA, which should have shown variation through maternal lines, was identical across every generation. Even the Y-chromosomal data, passed down through males, revealed no divergence whatsoever. It was the genetic equivalent of a closed loop, a lineage so self-contained that it had consumed its own definition of human difference. The lead geneticist described it as an impossible purity, the kind that could only be achieved through countless cycles of inbreeding. What began as a scientific analysis soon felt like an autopsy of something beyond human comprehension. As the data was reviewed, the photographs from the cabin were re-examined. Faces once dismissed as mere resemblances now appeared as genetic repetitions, the same sharp jawline, the same pale eyes, the same faint scar above the left brow in every portrait, even across supposed decades. It was as though time hadn't passed for them but only looped, recreating the same image under new names. Investigators theorized that each generation had been born from the same blood, brother to father, father to daughter, endlessly cycling through roles until no distinction remained. When the DNA evidence was presented to local authorities, it was met with disbelief. The possibility that an entire family could exist in such genetic confinement without outside contact for generations seemed unreal, yet the evidence was irrefutable. The bodies were all too similar, their identities merging in a way that stripped individuality entirely. The oldest remains matched the youngest with 99.9% precision. It was as if nature itself had given up trying to tell them apart. One of the investigators, shaken after reviewing the report, remarked that it didn't feel like tracing a family tree anymore. It felt like chasing a single root that had grown back into itself, strangling everything around it until nothing remained but one name repeated through centuries: Clara. The cradle was discovered in what investigators later called the sealed room, a small chamber hidden behind a false wall in the back of the cabin. It was almost overlooked at first, the uneven paneling in the wood mistaken for age and warping. But when one of the team members brushed their hand across it, they felt a faint draft seeping through. With some effort, the boards were pried loose, revealing a narrow doorway that led into a space barely large enough for two people to stand in. The air was thick and dry, carrying the faint scent of lavender mixed with decay. A single lantern hung from a nail in the ceiling, long since burned out, and in the center of the room sat a small cradle carved from dark, weathered oak. Despite decades of dust coating the rest of the cabin, the cradle was spotless, as if someone had been tending to it long after everything else had been abandoned. The first thing the investigators noticed was the way it moved. It rocked gently, back and forth, though the air inside the room was utterly still. They thought it might have been caused by the floorboards shifting when the wall was opened, but the rhythm never changed, steady and deliberate, like the breathing of something alive. When they shone their flashlights on it, they saw that the cradle's lining was made from hand-stitched cloth, stained dark with age. Embroidered across the fabric in small, careful letters were the words, "Our Forever Child." Inside lay a bundle of blankets folded around what appeared to be a small wooden doll, its eyes painted shut and its limbs crudely jointed. Around its neck hung a silver locket, engraved with two initials, CM. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence pressed down heavy, broken only by the faint creak of the cradle. One of the investigators reached out to stop its movement, but before their hand touched it, the rocking slowed on its own and came to a complete stop, as though acknowledging the intrusion. A faint chill rippled through the room, and the temperature seemed to drop instantly. When the locket was opened, it revealed a faded photograph, the same man, woman, and child seen in the portraits, the same unbroken resemblance passed between them. Beneath the photo, folded tightly inside the locket, was a piece of paper no larger than a coin. Written on it, in the same elegant handwriting as the journal, were the words, "She sleeps, but never alone." None of the investigators could explain why, After leaving the cabin, several of them later claimed to hear faint creaking sounds echoing from their equipment bags, as though something small and wooden were rocking inside. When the investigation turned toward the nearby town, the team expected to find records, testimonies, and stories that could shed light on the strange family who once lived in the cabin. What they found instead was silence, thick, deliberate, and older than memory itself. The town was small, a scattering of houses built along a narrow river road, their paint peeled and windows clouded. When the investigators began asking questions, people would listen politely, then turn away. Some muttered that there were places you don't talk about, and names better left where they belong. It wasn't the dismissive silence of ignorance, it was the guarded quiet of people who knew something and wanted desperately to forget. At the diner, one of the older residents finally spoke, though only after the others had left. She said the cabin didn't belong to anyone living, that it was a holdover from the old days when families kept to themselves. When asked what she meant, her eyes grew distant. She spoke of a man who used to come into town once every few months, trading hand-carved toys and animal pelts for flour, candles, and salt. He never gave his name, and no one ever saw where he came from, but the children whispered that he had eyes that looked two colors at once, gray and green, like water over stone. The old woman said she hadn't seen him since she was a girl, but sometimes she still dreamed of hearing a woman's lullaby coming from the woods, faint and slow, the same melody she heard him humming when he passed through the town square. Other townspeople refused to acknowledge that anyone had ever lived beyond the ridge. When shown photographs of the cabin and the portraits found inside, a few recognized the faces but refused to say how. One man grew angry, his voice trembling as he said, they weren't supposed to exist anymore. It ended years ago. The more the investigators pressed, the stronger the resistance became. Some claimed the cabin had burned down decades earlier, that it couldn't possibly still be standing. Others swore it had never existed at all. The contradictions only deepened the mystery, making it seem as if the entire community had made an unspoken pact to erase the family from history. By the third day, most residents had stopped answering their doors altogether. The investigators returned to their motel to find their tires slashed and their notes scattered across the parking lot. Scrawled on the windshield in something that looked like mud were 4 words that none of them ever forgot: leave the blood alone. The box of cassette tapes was found hidden beneath a loose plank in the floor, directly beneath the bedframe where the journal had first been discovered. The tapes were wrapped in layers of waxed cloth, carefully preserved as if someone had meant for them to survive time itself. Each one was labeled with a single date, handwritten in the same elegant script as the journal. The earliest tape was dated 1974, and the most recent bore a date that matched the year the cabin was believed to have been abandoned. When the investigators first played them back, the sound that filled the speakers was faint and distorted, like something pulled from underwater. Then, beneath the static, a woman's voice began to speak. It was soft, deliberate, almost hesitant, as though she were afraid of being overheard. The voice identified itself as Clara. She spoke in fragments at first, describing her days, her work, and her duties to father. There was a strange intimacy in her tone, the kind reserved for both confession and devotion. On some tapes, she spoke to someone she called Papa, asking if she had been good, if she had done as she was told. The investigators assumed Papa was the same man from the portraits and the journal, but something about the recordings unsettled them. In one of the later tapes, the voice responding to Clara was not a man's at all, it was another woman's voice, deeper, rasped by age, yet eerily similar to Clara's own. The two voices overlapped at times, repeating the same phrases, whispering each other's names in unison, like echoes caught in an endless loop. As the tapes continued, the content grew darker. Clara began describing the children, how they cried even when they weren't hungry, and how father told her they were born remembering. Her words slipped between moments of clarity and madness, her laughter breaking into sobs that dissolved into whispers. On one tape, she spoke about the lullaby she sang to calm the crying, the same melody that several investigators claimed to have heard faintly while inside the cabin. In the final recording, the sound was nearly unrecognizable. Static filled the air, and Clara's voice rose and fell like someone caught between waking and sleep. She whispered, "He says I am him now. He says my voice sounds right." Then, just before the tape cut out, there was a faint scraping noise, the sound of the recorder being moved, followed by a second voice, almost identical to hers, softly humming the same tune. When the audio engineers tried to clean up the recording, they discovered something impossible: both voices had been recorded at the exact same frequency, indistinguishable from one another, as if one person had spoken from two mouths at once. The search for the family's origins led investigators deep into old census archives and handwritten records stored in the county courthouse, where dust and mildew had long since claimed most of the pages. What began as an attempt to trace lineage quickly turned into a maze of vanishing names and repeating patterns. The same surname appeared in the town's birth registry as early as the 1800s, always attached to the same homestead near the ridge, yet every 25 years, the entire family seemed to disappear from the record, only to reappear again decades later under slightly altered spellings. No death certificates were ever filed, and no burial plots were recorded, as though each generation simply dissolved and returned wearing new faces. The pattern repeated with eerie precision, an unbroken cycle of birth, disappearance, and return. The investigators cross-referenced the names with old photographs, school lists, and land deeds, and the more they compared, the more disturbing it became. The people listed across different decades looked almost identical, not merely related but indistinguishable. In one school photograph from 1926, a young girl named Clara May appeared with the same pale eyes and distinct birthmark as a Clara M. registered in 1952. Even stranger, both had been listed as daughters of different fathers, though each father shared nearly identical facial features. The pattern made no genealogical sense, yet the evidence was undeniable. It was as if time had not moved forward for them but simply folded in on itself. When the team interviewed local historians, they learned that the ridge had long been avoided. Locals called it the hollow that remembers, claiming that people who built their homes there never aged the same as others. Some old-timers said it wasn't that they didn't die, but that they came back wrong. One retired pastor described it as a place where blood never left the earth, insisting that the family's lineage was kept alive by its own reflection. The notion sounded like superstition, yet the census records aligned too neatly with the legends to ignore. The most chilling discovery came from a church ledger dated 1901, where the baptism of a newborn named Clara was recorded in the same handwriting as one from 1951, both signed by different priests. It wasn't possible, and yet the ink, the signature, even the curvature of the letters matched perfectly. When digital facial reconstruction was applied to the photographs collected across a century, the software returned the same result every time, a single composite face, one that mirrored the woman from the journal, the portraits, and the tapes. It was then that investigators began to wonder whether the family ever truly died at all, or if they had simply been reborn again and again, preserving themselves through a bloodline that refused to end. The night the investigator went missing began like every other night spent at the edge of the forest, quiet and heavy with fog. The team had decided to stay near the site to gather audio readings and environmental data after several members reported hearing faint noises coming from the direction of the cabin after dark. The missing man, a field technician named Harlan Reeves, volunteered to stay behind when the rest of the team retired to their temporary base at a nearby motel. He was calm, methodical, and deeply skeptical of the superstitions that had begun to unsettle the others. Before they left, he radioed that he would set up one last motion sensor near the cabin's entrance and recheck the perimeter before joining them. That was the last time anyone heard his voice. When Reeves failed to respond to the morning check-in, the team returned to the cabin at sunrise. His equipment was still there, the radio buzzing faintly with static, but his truck remained untouched. The door to the cabin stood half open, though they had left it sealed the night before. Inside, there was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no footprints except his own. His flashlight lay on the ground beside the cradle, its beam flickering weakly against the wall. On the recorder strapped to his vest, the tape had run out, but what was captured before it ended chilled everyone who listened. The first few minutes were ordinary, the creak of floorboards, the sound of Reeves speaking quietly to himself as he adjusted the sensors. Then came a pause, followed by what sounded like faint humming, a woman's voice singing somewhere just beyond the cabin walls. Reeves called out, assuming one of his colleagues had returned early, but there was no reply. The humming continued, slow and rhythmic, gradually growing louder until it was almost inside the room. Reeves whispered something indistinct, his breathing quickening, and then there was the unmistakable sound of the cradle beginning to rock. He tried to leave, but the door slammed shut with such force that the recorder distorted. The final seconds were filled with overlapping whispers, soft and layered, repeating his name over and over, not in fear or anger, but with familiarity, as though welcoming him home. When the tape was played back at the lab, an audio technician noticed something unusual buried beneath the static. In the last 3 seconds, just before the recording cut off, a woman's voice could be heard clearly whispering the words, "You came back, Papa." Forensic teams searched the woods for days, but Reeves was never found. Only his motion sensors remained, and every night at precisely 2:17 a.m., each one recorded the same faint lullaby echoing through the trees. Months passed after the disappearance, and the investigation into the cabin had officially been suspended. The authorities cited lack of evidence, the isolation of the area, and the psychological toll on the team. But even after it was sealed off, strange reports continued to surface. Hikers claimed to see light flickering through the trees late at night, in a place where there should have been nothing but darkness. Hunters spoke of hearing singing deep in the forest, a soft and haunting melody that stopped the moment anyone tried to follow it. Some described the sound as coming from beneath the ground itself, as if the earth was exhaling an old song. Locals warned outsiders not to go near the ridge, saying the woods didn't like being disturbed after what had been found there. The first investigator to return to the site did so alone. She had been part of the original team, the one who catalogued the DNA evidence, and something about the case refused to leave her mind. When she arrived, the forest was silent, yet she swore she could smell candle smoke on the wind. The official seals that had been nailed across the cabin's entrance were still intact, but the padlock hung open. She thought maybe vandals or curiosity seekers had broken in, but as she pushed open the door, she realized nothing inside had been touched. The same table, the same dust, the same cradle in the corner, unmoved. Yet there was one detail that hadn't been there before, a faint line of footprints in the dust, leading from the cradle to the back wall, and stopping abruptly where the false door to the sealed room had once been. She set down her flashlight and began recording her notes, her voice steady but tense. The air felt heavier than it had months before, almost charged, as though something was waiting. She noticed the portraits on the wall, once dim and faded, now clearer, as if the faces had been wiped clean. The man's expression seemed sharper, his eyes following her no matter where she stood. The cradle began to creak softly, the rhythm slow and deliberate, though no air moved in the room. She stepped toward it, but the sound stopped abruptly, and in that silence came something worse, the sound of breathing, faint and uneven, just behind her. When backup arrived hours later, her car was still parked outside with the engine running. The cabin was empty, her recorder lying in the middle of the floor. The last 2 minutes of the audio captured nothing but her voice whispering one word over and over, her tone breaking between fear and disbelief. She kept repeating the name, Clara, and just before the tape ended, another voice, identical to hers, quietly replied, "Yes." The final DNA test was conducted weeks after the second disappearance, when the investigation was quietly reopened under a new department directive. The goal was to close the case definitively by identifying the remains found in the burial pit behind the cabin. Forensic analysts expected to find confirmation that the bones belonged to the family members whose names appeared in the old records. Instead, the results shattered every remaining assumption. The bones, though of different sizes and ages, all belonged genetically to one single individual. The tests were repeated again and again, sent to independent labs, but the conclusion never changed. Every sample, adult, child, male, and female, carried the same genetic markers. It wasn't a family at all. It was the same person, multiplied through time, replicated across generations. The lead investigator couldn't comprehend what the data implied. Forensic logic failed to explain how the same DNA could reappear across decades, or how one genetic identity could persist in multiple bodies. The most disturbing result came from the skeleton buried deepest in the pit, which should have been over 100 years old. Its DNA matched perfectly with the tissue sample taken from the remains near the cabin's bed, a match so precise that even identical twins couldn't achieve it. The analysts described it as a closed system, a bloodline that had stopped evolving, feeding entirely on itself until time and biology no longer mattered. When the photographs from the excavation were compared, a detail emerged that unsettled everyone who saw it. On the skull of the oldest skeleton, faint etchings had been carved along the bone, circular patterns intertwined with symbols resembling family crests. Near the center, in a trembling hand, one phrase was scratched so deeply that it left grooves in the bone. "He is in all of us." Forensic experts debated whether the message had been carved post-mortem or while the person was still alive, but no conclusion could be reached. The final report summarized the findings in sterile language, but none of the investigators could shake the implications. The man referred to as father, husband, and creator was not simply a figure of authority, he was the same entity passed down through flesh, generation after generation, until the line had devoured itself completely. When the remains were scheduled for transfer to the state lab, a lab assistant conducting a final inventory noticed that one of the bone samples was missing, the fragment that had belonged to the most recent burial. That same night, motion sensors around the cabin recorded brief movement inside, though the building had been sealed for months. The next morning, the door was found open again, and on the cradle, written in fresh dust, was a single word pressed by a human fingertip: Clara.